Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to another edition of Discovery. My name is Alison Mostowich, and I'm the Director of Engagement at Efficiency Canada. I am joining you from Mokinstys, which is the Blackfoot word for elbow. In the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina, the Nakota Nations, the Métis Nation within Alberta District 6, and all the people who make their homes in Treaty 7 and this region of southern Alberta. I do acknowledge that I am a settler on these lands. So for those of you joining us for the first time, Efficiency Canada hosts Discovery every 2 weeks, and these sessions are really meant to bring the sector together to learn, to hear about new research, findings from pilots, and other relevant topics and innovations. So before we get started, just a reminder that the individuals here to present will present for about 20 minutes, and then we'll go into a question and answer period. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a question and answer box right there. There's also an upvote function in that question and answer box. So if you see a question that you really like and you'd like it to be asked, hit like. I tend to filter the questions by those who have the most likes. So those ones are going to get asked first. And if you don't see your question asked, then go ahead and type it in at any point during the presentation. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce you to these three lovely individuals. We have with us Brent Copperson, who is the founder and executive director of the Windfall Ecology Centre. We have Michael Lukowitz, who is the founding partner of Possibilian. And then we also have Ian McVeigh, who is the manager of sustainability for the Durham region. So they're going to share with us their blockchain-based protocol to facilitate energy efficiency labeling and data sharing for residential and commercial buildings to accelerate building retrofits. Thank you all for joining us, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you for the privilege of being able to present our work today. As Alison said, my name is Brent Copperson. I'm the founder and executive director of Windfall Ecology Centre. I'm joined today by my colleagues Michael and Ian. And I hope that Ian and Michael will introduce themselves with a little more background in a few moments. But for those unfamiliar with Windfall Ecology Centre, we are a nonprofit social enterprise. We've been designing and delivering sustainability programs for cities, businesses, and homes since 1998. We have been an innovator in the residential energy efficiency assessment and retrofit space for 23 years. Notable projects include piloting with Green Communities Canada, what is now Ontario's province-wide home retrofit program for income-eligible families, designing and delivering Canada's first community-wide home energy retrofit program with the Chippewa of Georgina Island First Nation, and co-developing the City of Toronto's net zero policy strategy for the existing buildings. So that's a little bit of background on Windfall, and now I'd just like to say a little bit about the Windfall Protocol and how this came to be an area of great interest to the project partners, the Windfall Protocol research partners. Over the years, Windfall has designed and or delivered just about every type of home retrofit program Ontarians have seen. And we have gained intimate insight into the barriers to accelerating home retrofits. And one of our greatest frustrations has centered around data acquisition, data quality, data sharing, data permissioning, data security. It's really a complex mesh of systems that is very difficult to navigate and very difficult to move forward and to get data and to share data. So the existing systems are highly centralized, they're siloed, and they're rife with seemingly insoluble issues and bottlenecks. And we believe that this is an area that is really ripe for disruption. And the Windfall Protocol research groups recently completed and published an NRCan funded Litepaper, which proposes a way forward through systemic change and open source shared infrastructure that we believe could enable rapid scaling in the retrofit market. The Durham Green Homes program, or the platform, was developed by Windfall Ecology Centre and is an ideal place to pilot a minimum viable version of the Windfall Protocol, and we are working towards that goal now. Windfall has been performing virtual home energy assessments since 2014. We use them to qualify homes for retrofit programs, and our Durham Greener Homes energy coaches use them to inform conversations with homeowners who yet to have an EnerGuide assessment. And in the coming weeks, Windfall is rolling out our data-driven VHEAT virtual audit technology to over 200,000 Part 9 homes in Durham region. And the VHEAT acronym stands for Virtual Home Energy Assessment Technology. Every home in Durham will receive a VHEAT energy label, and homeowners will have access to a VHEAT user interface where they'll be able to easily model the impacts of their home energy retrofit and book an appointment with an energy coach. The Durham VHEAT program also incorporates a voluntary disclosure map to enhance the labeling ubiquity in the region. So before getting into the meat of the Windfall Protocol, I'd like to invite Ian McVeigh, who's the Manager of Sustainability with Durham Region, to provide some insights from a municipal perspective. Over to you, Ian.
Great. Thanks a lot, Brent. Ian McVeigh, in the Manager of Sustainability with Durham Region. We are, as the name suggests, a regional municipality within the Greater Toronto Area, just east of Toronto, with lakeshore municipalities on Lake extending north up to Lake Simcoe and Lake Scugog. So very large jurisdiction with urban, suburban, rural land use. We have 8 local area municipalities within Durham Region. Some larger like Oshawa, Whitby, Ajax, but also a lot of smaller ones in the north and the rural parts of our municipalities. Uxbridge, Brock, Scugog are those ones. Very diverse building stock homes. We have a population of about 700,000 people, 200,000 single family homes. So when we look at our low carbon pathway, we know that decarbonization of buildings and particular homes, single family homes, is a key priority for us. And you can see here kind of the split of our, actually no, just back to the last slide there. Yeah, thanks, Michael. The split of our emissions. We know buildings and transportation are really the key areas that we need to focus on. And indeed, when we looked at our low carbon pathway and our strategy, we know that getting all of those 200,000 existing homes retrofitted is the biggest shift that we need to make to meet our low carbon.
Oh, you're frozen, Ian.
Thanks to funding from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. So we launched Durham Greener Homes in April of 2022. Thanks in no small part to funding through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and their community efficiency financing program. There are a number of municipalities across the country that have taken advantage of this program to launch sort of local home energy retrofit programs. So ours is somewhat unique in that we're partnering with our local area municipalities and the energy utilities, and really through Windfall delivering this home energy coaching service to help people access energy advisors, get contractors, and take advantage of incentive and financing programs. Ours is unique with a third-party financing offer through some local community-based financing institutions, credit unions. We've had some good success to launch this program over the past 2 years. We've had 1,000 homeowners sign up for the program and take advantage of some of the services, and more than 100 deep energy retrofits delivered thus far. But as you can imagine, given the 200,000 homes that need to be completed over the next 25 years, we really need to figure out ways to accelerate that activity, which is where some of the tools that Brent and Michael are going to be talking about come in.
Thanks for the insight, and we're going to turn it over to Michael, who is really our subject matter expert here. And Michael is many things, among which Michael is also the chair of Windfall Ecology Centre, and he's got an interesting background, and I hope you'll share some of that, Michael.
Sure. Hi, I'm Michael Lukowitz. As Brent said, I have a long history in the energy efficiency space back to 2003, starting from a venture capital investment perspective and founding a thermal energy company. Then working with Brent on a number of different projects, some policy related, some finance related, and ultimately joining the board of Windfall, where I've been since that time. My focus has been at this intersection of technology, finance, and systems design, particularly relate to social and systems innovation. I've been particularly involved in blockchain related technologies and systems starting in 2017 and investing and building new solutions within that space pretty actively since about 2021. So this is what's really informed kind of the setup around we started recognizing the deep challenges that are within energy efficiency retrofits and coordinating it, particularly in relation to data. I think, as we all know, reducing energy in buildings is an absolute critical pillar for net zero targets, and there's no way we get there without it. Some of the work that we've done with a variety of partners, thanks in part to Ian and the Durham Greener Homes as well as some deep research and system design folks within the called BlockScience within the crypto economic system design ecosystem, did a real deep dive into what are some of the barriers and underlying challenges that we're facing with accelerating retrofits at scale. Most of these, I think, are pretty obvious to those that are part of it. Real capital cost and split incentives around doing retrofits and improvements, uncertain benefits and quality, often from the process itself, complexity and disruption that's involved in actually doing the retrofits, and lack of information, engagement, and trust. All those things are major barriers that we face, and the example or data point that tells us that this is the case is at our current pace, it'll take us 70 years to retrofit commercial buildings in Toronto alone. And for residential buildings, it's 142 years. So clearly the way we are coming at it is not working, and it's not for a lack of effort. It's not for a lack of data on showing that this makes sense. It's a challenge around coordination. So what we came to in our research was asking this question is, what if every building itself could securely coordinate its own data and incentives? So this is the fundamental premise behind what we've landed with the Windfall Protocol, is being able to enable through blockchain technology, and I'll explain that in a moment, buildings being able to be the center point for coordination around data, incentives, providing control to owners and occupants, and linking through to third parties everywhere from contractors and utilities to regional municipalities, provincial governments, and finance providers. What that would actually look like in terms of what that could enable in terms of something, a very practical type of interface, is you could imagine an energy efficiency label for a building that obviously had the data around both what is the modeled energy consumption of that home, coupled with alongside the actual energy data or energy performance over a period of time. By building on a system like this, we could also incorporate access to audit histories and data files in a secure and permissioned way, with extremely granular permissioning for those parties that are who own and have control of data, coupled with those that they want to be able to share it with. The system could also enable trustless privacy verification of the data that we're looking at. So verification that data is real, that it was created by the creators that created it, and it refers to the property that is mentioned. It could also become a layer of managing incentives and the claim process around them, and even automating that information based on building, automating those incentives and finance based on building information. Basically takes what we know to be virtual labels and empowers them with capabilities that we all would like to use. Let me explain a little bit more about why this is possible and why blockchain technology is important in this process. First of all, blockchain-based technology or digital ledger technology is another way to describe it. It's basically just a database that records a series of events and makes sure that that series of events is immutable. You can also have those pointers and that information coalesce around a specific object. And in this case, we can use that, make that object the specific building itself. So this would allow coordination to happen around a building versus just individuals or individual service providers. Blockchain-based technology also allows us to ensure data availability and sovereignty on a very specific, on a very granular basis. This is incredibly important in our energy efficiency space because of the sensitivity around information and the value of sharing information that is otherwise, that could be useful in a variety of solutions that we try to deliver. It also enables smart incentives to be designed. So it can programmatically verify actions that are being done in relation to that building, and it could actually, based on those actions, streamline capital movement around those specific incentives. And finally, perhaps most important when it comes to how do we build these infrastructures is that this inherently is shared infrastructure. It can be economically sustainable because it can be open source shared infrastructure amongst all participants, generating a collective fees that go to supporting the infrastructure and allowing others to generate revenue on top of it for their specific applications. This is critical and a critical way that we need to address this for being able to move forward at scale. The core building blocks in this system, I'm going to touch this really quickly and go to some more specific examples, but the underlying thing is building ledgers and a attestation service on top. And an attestation service means we can verify any specific data point that we wish to in a variety of different ways. It allows us to basically build this ledger, this history of activity and pointers to information. An incentive designer that would allow us to plan incentives and systems based on that verifiable history of information. And then on top of that, a layer of interfaces and applications that could be built by anybody permissionlessly on top of that, based on the underlying information. What's really important here again is this point about stakeholders being underneath this. Stakeholders are the ones that drive the system and collectively own and operate the system. I'll explain quickly here how those key components that I mentioned. A building ledger basically allows authorized controllers to be able to access and post information into the building ledger. The building ledger itself can have different capabilities. It can actually have programmatic capabilities associated with it and contents information that's related to it. That could include data around the building or energy data. It can include assets attributed, which could be incentives or other resources. It can have records such as audits and proofs of actions that have been done in relation to that building, and it can have actions that are actually processed as a result of it. All of those things can be facilitated on top of the building ledger itself. The attestation layer was all about credentials, claims, and attestations. So this is what allows us to layer into that building ledger any bit of information that might be relevant to an audit process or to verification of certain outcomes and changes related to that building. Some examples that we might want to include on it is have auditors that have attested to the veracity of an audit, the underlying information that was used within that audit, and the actual details, individual granular details of what was included, information that was captured within that audit. All of those facets could be made available via a securely permissioned basis on the building ledger itself. Smart incentives and finance become the next layer that builds on top of that. So if you have a ledger that is tracking all these variety of data points, you have a whole host of data points and proof points that you can layer into this ledger, then you can start to actually build incentives that are responsive to those specific data points and automatically trigger follow-on actions. So in this case, we could have any of third-party stakeholders provide an incentive. So you could imagine a utility providing a performance incentive for example, even doing an audit up front. Once that audit is actually performed, that could be verified on chain and release the incentive directly. You could have competitions that are built based on actually energy performance that are funded by third parties based on the performance data of verified performance change of energy usage over time. There's no end to what we can do in terms of the types of incentives and finance that we could implement, because provided that the underlying information is available at scale. And to keep us on time, I'm just going to go quickly to where we've been in the process and where we're at right now. Initial research began about 8 months ago now. That process was supported by Natural Resources Canada, specifically in response to their request for dynamic virtual energy labeling and decentralized blockchain systems. We performed that initial research, which is evident in the Litepaper, developed and shipped the Litepaper, which there will be a link to this afterwards, and we're happy to share the results afterwards. We're currently in the process of scoping out the actual development and implementation, specifically around the Durham Greener Homes implementation and the rollout for that. The next steps from that is actually developing and piloting that implementation and then a subsequent launch. That whole process, likely a 6-month or so process to get through that, but that's where we're at now. I'm going to pause there. Is there anything else you think I should be touching on before we open up to general questions and conversation?
No, I think you've covered it pretty well, Michael. There are a few questions in the Q&A.
Okay, great.
One of the questions was about a green button and the
Yes.
role the green button might play in the Windfall Protocol. And maybe you can speak to that.
If you noticed in the virtual label that we had, the virtual labeling that VHE provides, as an example, can provide the information related to the energy, expected energy consumption. But that circle on the right that actually had validated performance is based on a green button linkage. So within the protocol, we could seamlessly enable a green button connection, which would verify the owner occupant of that building and be able to take data, providing a proof of performance of energy usage. Now, importantly, in this kind of a system, the user does not share that energy related data. That data does not have to be made public except in ways that they approve. So it might be available in a specific granular detail on the label itself, but the entirety of the data could be available in a way that's permissioned for future uses going forward. For example, they may be willing to make that available for broad government research and analysis going forward, or independent research understanding of profiles around energy usage. It might be useful in ways that third parties could design incentives, et cetera. But plugging into green button is a key part of what allows us to actually add a whole layer of verification onto the changes in energy consumption quite seamlessly. We've heard that there are a number of challenges to utilities around implementation of green button programs from a resourcing perspective of what does it look like to actually enable this in a way that is useful to consumers. This is part of where running this as a shared and collective infrastructure allows us to pool those resources into establishing a system that could be directly useful for utility customers and homeowners broadly across the province in a way that is reusable by all parties equally, which is a really important part of these things being shared infrastructure and implementations.
Great, super. Another really good question. Did you make a new building energy assessment methodology with this program? If so, why? And why not link with NRCan, NRGuide, and the Certified Energy Advisor process? So we have an answer.
This is, yes, Brent, I imagine you're going to follow up on this as well, but let me start by saying the intentional design of this underlying system is to not try to enforce standards in its own right. We know that the best way to approach scaling and enabling this ecosystem to be able to be more effective is by enabling the existing standards within the system. So our approach, instead of, if I go back to that attestation layer, it is about, is the veracity of information shared, verifying the source of the information under which program and standard is provided, and that being available, being usable, more usable within the system itself. This means that we could accommodate any set of standards that different jurisdictions or different bodies wanted to be able to introduce. They're freely able to incorporate those into this system and allowing the interoperability to be happen at a second layer. We're not trying to enforce a new standard or need to use a new standard at this point. If somebody created a new one, they could import that or start using that within the system equally well.
Another question, would this be used for residential and commercial buildings?
Yes, this has absolute applicability to any building context because it addresses the fundamental challenges of layering data, having verifiable data, and then building an implementation or incentive and action layer on top of that. What can be created on top is broad ranging. Anything you can do with software effectively means you could do it on top of that underlying data. That pattern is the same for whether it is residential or commercial and opens up a scope of other opportunities. The start point of research was focused specifically on the Durham Greener Homes program from a residential standpoint. We have a clear path to implementation that can scale quickly across Ontario and then subsequently across the province. But the applicability for commercial, we've had a number of conversations that suggest there is very, very effective uses of the same system within that context. So yes.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question to that one?
Mm.
Thanks. So I'm just curious, you talked about scalability a lot. And when you're talking about individual dwellings and single family homes, is there sort of, when you're talking about the scalability of data and the information you're able to extrapolate from that, is there kind of like a magic number that you're looking for? Is there sort of like a level of scalability that you're looking to hit?
From a system perspective, what's really important is that the underlying infrastructure is practically useful to as broad a number of the stakeholders in the system currently. That's really the core focus around that, because the thesis there is that if this is useful and solves everyday implementation challenges for existing stakeholders, that will bring adoption into the system. Specifically, though, we have looked at why we've chosen the lead with greener homes. Being able to do the virtual labeling means we can scale rapidly across all homes with existing municipal data in the province to deliver those virtual labels, which creates a value proposition for users at the outset to be able to see that data in a way that is privacy preserved and only available to them, but makes it accessible, easily deployable to them. Couple that with the green button program, again, makes a nice interface to be able to say, here's my label, great, you can take a look at it. By the way, click this button now and you can log into your utility provider and layer in the additional data of your actual energy performance for all stakeholder participants as a baseline to build on top of.
Right. And because we're Canada-wide, can you just talk a little bit we've got some people that aren't super familiar with green button programs. So do you want to just mention what a green button program is in case we have people on the line that haven't accessed that before?
Yes, the Green Button program is essentially a utility, a program that utilities provide API access into the consumer's energy data. So as a homeowner or occupant that pays a utility bill, I should be able to click a button and permission third parties to use that data and get download of it myself. So it basically allows that data to be accessible. The challenge is the implementation barrier of, on the utility side, making that easy to do. And then on the consumer side, what the heck do I do with that in a way that's useful for the average consumer? That's what allows us to be able to do that. In Ontario, all utilities are mandated to be able to provide green button access. And so that provides a good pilot use case in the Ontario region to be able to scale this initially for that specific application. But I'll say labeling, as we know, virtual labeling is happening Canada-wide already and is a perfectly good start point and allows us to be able to address this Canada-wide from the beginning.
Right. Thanks. I appreciate it. I'll pass it back to you. You've just been doing such a great job asking questions. Go for
Well,
it.
I just realized I took over your job, and so I'm happy to pass it back to you.
So the next question is, can you clarify if utility advanced metering infrastructure is a prerequisite for this work?
No, it's not. So again, there's two sides to this. One is the data is leveraging existing data that may be captured by audits or using tools that provide virtual labels as an example. That's a way that we can layer data onto the building ledgers themselves. As a start point, the provision of energy information, Green Button provides it based on however the utility is capturing that data. So it does not require advanced metering infrastructure for the protocol to plug into. Where there is additional sources of data that could be able to be streamed or linked into the buildings, those become all additive into the system. So we just don't require it.
Great, thank you. So this is kind of an interesting question. And as you were presenting, I was curious about end user experience too. And I think this one speaks to that a little bit. So would this system not work if your furnace, your heating or cooling source is not connected to the internet? So if you don't have any smart appliances, and so how would this impact rural areas if the internet's not by wire?
Correct. So what's really important here about this system is this is not, we can think about this as a back-end infrastructure to be able to facilitate connection of data that is available through a variety of different sources. So it doesn't mean that we have to be interfaced with a digital online in the home itself. To the smart metering, we don't need to connect the meters directly. So it's meant to work particularly well or equally well in any jurisdiction where data is available and collected in some form or another. Often that's a very manual process in terms of coming up with municipal property data, which has key information that allows virtual labeling to be done. So virtual labeling, again, has been addressing some of these challenges about accessibility, in particular into remote and rural areas, that mean they can be a participant in this. Anywhere where the customer is a utility customer, the utility also has base data around energy usage in whatever form that energy is. You could imagine that data also making its way into the system if the stakeholders and users are able to. Again, Green Button is one subset of an example where it is mandated and enforced, but any utility has access to that data and could choose to be participating in the system going forward.
Fantastic.
And from a user, could we link that in? Absolutely. That just goes to more data points and more granular specificity. And the more things are controllable, those things could all be engaged with and interacted with as an application layer on top of this system. So you can think of the underlying building ledger as the coordinating entity that people can plug into, but it can fire actions to anything that could be connected over time. So there's a lot of opportunity for that. And in terms of consumer interface, people often, when they hear things like blockchain technology, they assume there's a certain skill set required. There isn't a skill set required for this. As a consumer or user of the system, you would not know that you're interfacing with a blockchain related system. And you could go so far as to interacting with a label could be provided in a paper-based format. A utility bill could have an information to the label. You could then go online with whatever mechanism you use to go online if you do to verify that label and the information. It can work behind the scenes as well. So the interfaces are any type of interface that we would normally use now. This can be underpinned by.
Fantastic. That's a great clarification.
I might just add that it's important to understand that the innovation possibilities that this opens up are just wild, because having this basic shared infrastructure allows other organizations or individuals to develop applications that do specific things, for instance, that could interface with a home's automation systems, and just opens up just a huge opportunity for innovation and new business development.
I think there's a lot of focus being turned to demand flexibility right now and how that can help us reduce our energy use. And there's a bunch of applications to demand side management. I'm seeing some connections there. That's really cool. And I think it's a good segue to the next question too. So we have a question about engaging private companies trying to develop digital label platforms. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is, again, fundamental to this system design is that it's open source and a shared infrastructure. So what that means is that it is permissionless in the sense that anybody can build on top of it. There is, to again reiterate very clearly, that in relation to data and information and actions that can be performed, that can be deeply permissioned, but it's permission at the level of the source beneficiary owner and, for example, owners and occupants, or the providers of data. So there's a lot of surface area to build any kind of application, private commercial applications on top of this that leverage the same infrastructure. If anything, it benefits all of us if all competitive systems are using the same infrastructure, because it's a shared cost infrastructure. And the more that we are collectively building on it, and the more the innovation happens on top of it, the more opportunities each individual private enterprise that may be deploying a system has to be able to make improvements to their system to introduce new features, et cetera, that they wouldn't be able to without this kind of a shared infrastructure underneath. So it's open, it's completely open in that sense.
Fantastic. We've got quite a few questions left in here. I'm loving, there's some municipal questions too. So maybe I'll jump down to those. So Cheryl's asking, can the data be manipulated within the system to establish KPIs and very specific municipal level driven reduction targets? So maybe Michael, you can talk about that. And Ian, maybe if you have any comment on that, it would be interesting to hear it from Durham's perspective.
This all comes down to, if there can be data in the system, we can imagine building on top, like permissioning on top of that, and being able to do analyses that we haven't been able to do. So that's all goes to the goal of what we want to achieve. And if there's data in the system, you can design an incentive specifically to that. So you could imagine dynamic incentives, not that are just one big program that runs over a year, but specifically is looking at which are let's incentivize audits to the buildings where their highest potential impact is, and design a system that just keeps going after those top audits the whole way along. So you could very granular design any kind of an incentive finance system based on that underlying data, because you can be responsive specifically to the data and the actions that are followed up in that process.
So Ian, someone had to convince you of this. So was that something that really resonated with Durham for you?
Well, yeah, I mean, the challenge we have is limited resources and capacity. And so how do we use that most effectively and efficiently? Currently, we're doing a lot of broad-based marketing without that sort of surgical focus. So I think that's the selling point, is how do we get smarter with the use of our limited municipal resources and capacity? So yeah, we know what our targets are. The question is, how do we achieve them? And I think that's where this is going to help us hopefully close that gap. But I think it also is going to help us maybe get a bit more realistic with respect to the virtual home energy audit technology, realistic around achievable potential within the region over a given time frame. So yeah, definitely helpful for us.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ian. That's really helpful perspective. Did you want to add something?
On the SC side as well of existing capital and incentive deployments, we can even think about like anybody who's gone through the audit, retrofit, and refund process. It's a very defined process based on checks and pre and post audits that generally takes 6 to 9 months before, from the beginning and best case to the homeowner having implemented and receiving capital at the end of it. With this data, being able to build on this type of an infrastructure, those actions could be instantaneous because they're verified that an audit was done by a certain auditor, and the data would suggest what is, if it's eligible for the next step. Payouts could be made immediately upon the follow-on audit if certain conditions are met. It could be based on subsequent energy performance improvements that are met. And across all that, it can be granular in who's getting compensated throughout that system. So that is an example of the granularity in which we can design that, which is just not able to happen now. But it means those cycles of the time delay between all of these things can go to nothing based on availability of this actionable data.
If I might add, the protocol also would open up opportunities for the aggregation of building retrofits. And this is a topic that is much discussed these days, but the missing link in being able to do this is having the data to actually realize where the cost savings could be, either across a geographic area or other kind of distribution.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, we're running into the constraints of time again, and we have way too many questions and not enough time. So I will ask this one because I do think it is a really important question. So there's a question about the longevity of the system. So sort of long term, who do you envision hosting this? What does this look like long term?
This is the best part that few, I think, understand, recognize around blockchain-based systems. But the entire protocol, under the protocol itself, one, it's open source, but when it's released, that software will run in perpetuity. As long as the blockchain exists, that software will continue to run. And so that's what's really important about these underlying systems, why I keep going back to this idea of shared infrastructure, is once these functionality are made available, that there's no individual party that controls it. It's the system itself and the collective participants that determine, provided it's getting used, then those participants are the stakeholders and determine how it gets developed and evolved and changed over time. And that is a continuous system design question that can be introduced and evolved over time. But there is the system itself perpetually runs on blockchain, the blockchain itself, which is what makes it as reliable and indestructible as absolutely possible.
I think everyone needs to go and read the Wikipedia article about blockchain because I will be the first to admit I'm not super familiar with it. It sounds amazing. So how is there quality control on the data though? How are you ensuring quality control on the data and that it is really high quality people and it's reliable?
Yeah, so this is where the notion of attestations come in. And so what's really important about that is you can have the people who are actually posting the data, that can come from a verified source. And so the only way that data can get posted is if they have actually signed that it is their key that is producing and sorting that data. So you can think about it like auditors, for example, and service providers are certified to be able to run the audits. You can have verifications that are this auditor is an auditor of this service provider. Both have current certifications that are active and up to date, and they provided this data which conform to this standard. You can have all those things provably verified that those actors did perform those actions, and so you can record that on chain. So you can know that did the data come from a reliable source or not. Whether the auditor performed their action to the way they're supposed to, that we can't control any better than the current system does, but we can confirm what the source of where it came from and be absolutely sure on that.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So before we close, there is a request for feedback on the Litepaper. I added the link to the Litepaper at the beginning, and I've just added it again to the chat for anybody that's interested in looking at it. You are looking for feedback on that paper. What does that feedback look like? What's the timeline on that? And then how do people just stay connected with this if they're interested?
Yeah, what I would suggest is, number one, feel free to email either Brent or I with any questions or interest in learning more or particular examples. We're particularly interested on what are the practical use cases that people are curious about, and those that are interested that get a sense that this may be useful for solving some of their real-time challenges in relation to deploying energy efficiency, either incentives or data coordination. We'd love to have those conversations because our sense is, and certainly from the conversation so far, there's a lot of common challenges that folks are having. And so if we can coordinate that interest to co-develop those solutions, that's the ideal scenario for us. You can also see on that link as well, you can subscribe and follow along and get involved as well. But feel free to email either Brent or I.
Fantastic. Brent, any closing remarks before we go for the day, or Ian?
No, I think, from our perspective, this is something that we think has to happen. We do need a common infrastructure and a way of communicating with one another and sharing data in order to meet our net zero objectives. And the time has come for a systemic change in this particular area because what we're doing now is just not working.
Agreed. Ian?
I have nothing to add, just that we're super happy to be working with Brent and Michael on this and being a bit of a guinea pig. So thanks.
Fantastic. I hope I can get you back on to talk about some of the pilot results. It's going to be really interesting to see how some of the use cases work in reality. So thank you all. So thank you all so much for joining us today. That was really interesting. I learned a lot about blockchain technology. I'm sure everybody on the line did too. So just so everybody knows, this will be posted on YouTube in about a week to a week and a half's time. If you want to share with your colleagues, I encourage you to share the video. And we will be back one more time before the summer break. We're going to host Summerhill, who is talking about concierge programs. Thanks everyone for joining us. Happy Friday. And again, Brent, Michael, Ian, thank you so much for joining us today. This was absolutely fascinating. Happy Friday, everyone. Take care.